Welcome to the Leadership Society interview series. This is a course that is focusing this year on the intersection of public and private leadership. And today I'm really excited to be talking to Governor Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts. So welcome, Governor Patrick.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
very much,
joining me.
Professor. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks. So, we spoke before November 2020. Um, lots has happened in the last 5 years. Lots going on since then. I'd love if you would kind of just share with people your experiences, your history with public and private leadership, in addition, obviously, to being governor.
Oh, wow. Well, I have worked in the private sector in as a lawyer and as a business executive at two Fortune 50 companies. In fact, I've spent probably most of my career in the private sector.
Mm.
I have worked as an appointee in the Justice Department as head of the Civil Rights Division. This is during the Clinton administration when the division was in the business of civil rights. And then in the public sector, 2 terms as governor of Massachusetts. That's the only thing I had run for. Um, I am uh, I am a teacher, part-time very much at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Have taught actually at Stanford Law School, of course, years ago, and also at Harvard Law School and BC Law School. And nowadays I'm doing investing work at a firm called the Vistria Group out of Chicago that is about investing for both uh, market returns and also positive social and environmental impact. And I'm really excited about that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. It's a really interesting history. So you're, I think, an ideal guest for our theme.
Yeah, sounds like I can't keep a job because I keep zigging and zagging. But
Or everybody wants you. It depends how you look at it. So can you give us an example of a successful public-private partnership during your tenure as governor or in one of your other roles? Just an example you think that really captures how the public and private sectors can work together well.
Mm. Well, maybe, yeah, I think I can. I'll maybe with this context first, if that's okay.
Mm,
Having worked on problem solving really all over the world, I would say that one of the things I observe about the United States is that the line is brighter here between public and private, which is to
mm,
say, it feels like we are really anxious about collaborations across those lines. And yet, I think most of the big challenges that face humankind aren't going to be solved by one sector working all on its own. It's got to be uh, problem solvers trying to work across sectors. When I was in office, we were hit by the Great Recession, so I had all these big plans, and then the bottom fell out of the global
mm,
economy. And I remember, I remember I had a group called the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors that had been around for multiple uh, uh, tenures of various governors, and as head of the Fed and labor economists and business leaders and so forth. And they convened and they said, Governor, we thought you should know that historically Massachusetts has gone into recession deeper and stayed in recession longer than most of the rest of the country. And I said, huh. And I said, and they said, well, we just thought you should know. I thought, oh my gosh, no, that's not gonna work. We gotta have a strategy to come out of recession, how we build our way out of recession rather than just wait for events to turn. And so we focused on 3 things: education, innovation, and infrastructure, because education in many respects in Massachusetts is the kind of natural resource, right? We have very highly educated workforce. We have I think it's 120 colleges, universities, research institutions, teaching hospitals within like 45 miles of downtown Boston. It's one of the most extraordinary concentrations of brain power in the world. And infrastructure, because there are certain things that enable all of that, that government has to do or be a part of.
Mhm.
And we talked about infrastructure broadly, not just roads, rails, and bridges, but also healthcare and housing. And I will say, Governor Romney had signed the healthcare expansion just as he left office. It took effect on my first day, so it was up to us to implement it. And we were then at 98% of our residents
Mhm.
insured, and have continued up incrementally from there. So, but all of that is to say, one of the areas we identified to grow economically was the life sciences and biotech. And we thought hard together with people in the industry in a small, kind of nascent uh, players in the space that were here. We thought about it together with folks in academia, with folks who are investors in that space. Again, just trying to understand what was the combination of resources we had already that would make for a lively and fruitful and impactful collaboration. And so we dedicated a lot of time and effort and ideas and a little bit of money. Um, I mean, it was $1 billion over 10 years. The whole idea of trying to get the legislature to think in 10-year and act in 10-year increments was a big deal. It took a year of persuasion. And then a lot of work just promoting it with others in the industry and others in innovation centers, if you will, around the world. And I'd say today, and many people do, we are the world destination for the life sciences and biotech. So that's an example, rather long-winded one, but an example of how I think of public-private partnerships.
I like that example. And in the example, you kind of you identified three resources that Massachusetts had: education, possibility of innovation, and infrastructure. And as I think about those three things, I kind of divide them into private public a little bit. I know you said that there's a brighter line in the US than other places in the world, but I'm
And
gonna lean on that line
maybe
for a little
brighter
bit.
than necessary in a lot of respects. That's what I mean.
Right, right. And so when I think about those three things, I think of infrastructure as primarily a governmental function, like to build basic infrastructure is at a scale that's something that without obvious immediate returns is something that the government is well positioned to do. Innovation is often more associated with private industry than with government. And education is an interesting one. I'll put that aside for a second. But
Yeah.
when you think
Yeah.
about, we'll come back to this one. We'll come back to this one. But when you think about public leaders, in this case, you as a role of governor, what is your role in managing those three things where they're not all functions of the government, where you did talk about it as a partnership. What is your role as a public leader? What is the role of public leaders in a well-functioning society? In this case, I'll just kind of limit it to managing those kind of three resources that I think all communities have to some extent.
So I think that I think there was a power, Professor, that I realized I had that isn't really written down. It might even be the greatest power that a governor has or someone in a position of public leadership, and that's the convening authority, right? You can get anybody to come sit at your conference table, anybody. The folks who always expect to have their phone call returned, whether the governor is of their party or not, and the folks who would never expect to get a call from the governor or from the governor's office and to come and sit down next to each other and problem solve together. I mean, that's how we got to 98% coverage through healthcare expansion.
Mhm.
Right? It wasn't the government all on our own or frankly all on our dime saying this is how we do it. We had to iterate, we had to learn and listen to one another about what it is we were trying to accomplish. And because I ran in the first place because I wanted our agenda to be ambitious. I wasn't interested in just, little tiny steps. I wanted us to think big. I wanted us to plan big, and I wanted us to think and plan with the long term in mind, not just the next election cycle. And I think that was a really important part of how I saw the role and
Mhm.
how I tried to behave in the
Mhm.
job. Does that make
No,
sense?
yeah, that makes sense, complete sense. And what I was gonna push a little bit on this because you have that an enormous convening power in part because there's a perception that you have power to
Mm.
change people's outcomes. And so how do you think about not misusing that power, right? So people are coming, you can argue that people make pilgrimages to the centers of power because they're concerned about their outcomes. And you can talk about that as convening power, but that gives it a nicer veneer in the way if you thought about other ways that you could be using that. So how do you think about
I
um
think I think I understand the question. I do want to maybe I'll come at it this way. I
mm,
don't think that I don't think that convening power or any other power should be misused. And by that I mean I I come to the work and I came to that job as a servant leader, not
mm,
somebody who presumed I had all the answers or that my party had all the answers. I think I'm where most people are. Most people aren't buying 100% of what either party is selling. But we do have a sense of what especially if we're listening, what is on people's minds and hearts, and what problem solving could look like. And because I have a experience in both the public and the private sector, and in the not-for-profit sector for that matter, you can begin to get a sense of who is better positioned to contribute what they can to the solution. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it
mhm,
wasn't, let's all sit down and figure out what it is government can do. What I found is that most people aren't looking for government to solve every problem in everybody's life. They're looking for government to do its part in helping them help themselves. And I have seen, and I think we've all seen lately, a very different approach to that kind of leadership. I hear your point about the convening power being used sort of or abused, let me put it that way, not just used for good, because I think we've seen some examples today of that convening power being used by and to serve the interest of a very, very narrow group of people. The rest of us be damned. And that is a different um, approach to leadership than the one I'm trying to talk about and the one I try to reflect.
mhm. I really appreciate the mentioning of the way you thought of yourself as a leader, as a public servant. And I think in a representative democracy, that's generally how it's designed to work. But as a leader, there's also places where you have to lead, right? So as a public servant, you represent the interests of your constituents, however you define them. But as a leader, you in some ways you're trying to point the way, not follow what you've been given. How do
Mhm.
you think about the tension between those two things, serving the pre-existing views of your constituents versus actually leading?
Well, I think I would say if you are mindful and if you're trying to be a servant leader, or maybe if you just me, I've felt that tension most days, right? It should be top of mind. It should be you know, I teach a course now that very much comes from my um, observations and experiences in politics with lots of people who are real clear about how to get the job, but they haven't really thought about why they want it. They want to have the job, they don't necessarily want to do it. And doing it is about not just accumulating your political capital, right? It's about spending your capital to get stuff done and move things forward. And if you are trying to solve all of the people and do as much good for as many uh, people as you can in the time you have. In my case, it was thinking about the folks, as I said earlier, not just who will always have a space at the governor's conference table, but the ones who couldn't imagine having a place at the governor's conference table, but whose
Mhm.
interests are on the line. And you learn so much from having all of those interests at the same table and asking them to listen to and respond to one another. You learn about where problems can be solved and can't, or where they can be, where situations can be improved or not. And then at other times, and this may get to the question you're asking me, Professor, it's a very solitary and lonely kind of job. Like I remember when the bombs went off at the Boston Marathon, and we were in an environment of fear and uncertainty in those ensuing days, and everybody had a role to play, not just the officials, the folks who were first responders or the medical folks, the officials around the race and so forth, but reminding citizens that they had a role to play too in showing acts of grace, in comforting each other and holding and looking out for their neighbors and trying to keep this community together. And so when we got to the point on the law enforcement side of understanding who those two terrorists in a haystack, terrorist needles in a haystack, really were, there was a question about when to bring the public into that, in particular, when to show photographs
Mm.
that we have had of the suspects. And we had these grainy images, I want to say, on Wednesday night. They weren't all that, it wasn't clear who they were. We hadn't identified the individuals by name. And some in law enforcement wanted to release those. And I said, we're not doing that. Now, that's not my decision to make, but because we were working as a team, they brought that decision to me because it's a pretty sensitive decision. I said, we're not doing that because all you get in these images are not actual faces, just kind of brown skin. And we are not going to have another situation. We'd had one years ago here in something called the Charles Stewart case,
Yeah.
where every person who has brown skin becomes a person feared or suspected. And instead of turning to each other, which we need to do in a calamity like that, we would instantly turn on each other. And I said, you come back to me when you have better images, real images, and IDs. And it took about 24 hours, not quite. And they had the photographs and they came back and I said, okay, but you got to wait. We were in the midst of or just at the end of an interfaith service. And the president and Mrs. Obama were here. And I said, you got to wait till Air Force One is wheels up because there's a lot of other stuff law enforcement is having to do when the president's on the ground. And
Mm.
as soon as the photographs are released, everything will speed up. I know that. And I laugh about it now in some ways because I don't think the wheels were fully retracted on Air Force One as it was taken off before those photographs were released, and indeed everything sped up. But my point I'm making with too many words is that there were, I hoped, in most of those hard decisions and solitary decisions, still a values clarity that I was trying to bring to the work about how I would make those decisions when I did, and I tried to explain that to the people I worked with and to
Mm.
the larger public.
Got it. So that's a really interesting description of your sense of responsibility as a public leader, and also as an individual, because it could have been in that 24 hours, something else would have happened. You didn't know if they would have engaged in some other act of terrorism, then I don't know how would that decision have played in that situation. So I think there's risk in those kind of decisions, and I think what you're suggesting is you find the focus on the values as a way to think about how to manage those decisions where it's not clear what the right answer is.
Too.
Mhm. So as a private leader, though, what do you think your role is because you also have many private roles. In fact, you said you've had more roles in the private sector than the public sector. As a private leader, what is your responsibility to a well-functioning society, your contribution, do you think?
Well, I'm of the view, um, it's funny, it sounds kind of outlandish today, but it's actually old-fashioned that a business um, has responsibility to multiple stakeholders. Yes, the actual shareholders are one, but the employees are another. The community in which that business operates or communities, um, the environment, they are all about long-term value. And if we're just leading to get next quarter's results, sometimes that can blur the judgments around what the impact is on long-term value of the enterprise. By the way, it's the same bad habit that has infected our politics and our public and our policy making, right? It's the next election or news cycle instead of the next generation. And being willing to make those choices that are in favor of the next generation is to me what responsible leadership is about, whether that's in the public or the private sector.
Mm. And how would you respond to a number of people, and this will not be a surprising question to you, I think, where they say that private industry's job is to create economic opportunity. Anything outside of that is beyond their purview. They're not there to make judgments about how society should work. They're there to obviously play within the bounds of the law, but operate within the bounds of the law, but to produce economic growth, and everything else is outside of their purview.
No, I could make the same argument about my approach to business. Yeah, no margin, no mission. You got to make money. I get that. I'm just saying, and I think there are lots and lots of examples of this today and in the past, that the higher value enterprise is one that is actually behaving not just at the edge of the boundaries of the law, but responsibly with respect to all of its stakeholders. For example, it costs a whole lot more money to backfill roles in a business that is constantly dealing with turnover than it does to invest in building a stable workforce, treating them well, making them feel included, helping them understand what the mission is and their contribution to it. And there's so many examples of that, right? Um, in today's world on the environmental side, you might think you can get away with dumping something, into the local estuary of some kind or another, but with cell phone cameras and all the rest, it's all gonna you it will be revealed in the fullness of time. And now the fullness of time doesn't take very long. And all of a sudden, all kinds of resources and attention go to trying to explain or clean that up. You can do the right thing at the beginning, or you can do the right thing at higher cost later on. And those examples go on and on and on. It blows my mind that we're still fussing about diversity in the boardroom or in the workforce, or frankly, in any room where decisions are made, when there is so much data and so much experience I've had that having a diversity of backgrounds and points of view in the room where the decisions are made produces a better, more sustainable decision. So, you know, um, I hear the folks who say that the business of business is just to make money, but I'm talking about the same thing too. I want to make money when I'm in business, and I'm talking about not just the way to make a quick buck, but how to make money over time and through time in a way that sustains itself.
Mm. And here's another issue that's come up quite a bit lately, and also at educational institutions in particular. When, if ever, do you think private leaders should speak out about issues of public interest that go beyond their business?
I think that's a complicated one. I think when I am asked this in private settings, what I say to folks is, what do you say to your employees about what the values of your enterprise or what the values of your university are? And when the issue is one that has captured the attention of your community, you have at a minimum a sort of pastoral responsibility almost to that community to speak to that issue. Doesn't mean you got to have a point of view on everything, but if your values say one thing and there's something that has deeply rattled um, your stakeholders um, uh, that is contrary to those values, and I think there's at least an argument to be made for why you should speak out. And when you think about it, when you think about the fact that businesses are more trusted institutions, if you will, than what used to be called institutions like governments or churches or other houses of worship and so forth, then I understand why the pressure to do that. It's a mistake, in my view, for people to expect every business leader or every business to spout off about everything that's in the public domain. So I do think there should be something around which something, the business's values are or are not aligned with that issue, and it is on the minds and hearts of the people who work for you and invest in you.
Mhm.
Not a bright line, but I think it's just kind of keeping your head down and pretending like calamitous things aren't happening um, is naive.
Mm. So I'll push a little harder on this one too, then. What do you think about the neutrality statements that a lot of universities are making? And I'll still
Get
say,
that? No, I get that, right? You want to have free flow of ideas and academic and intellectual freedom. I understand all that. What I don't understand is the reluctance of folks in the academy to say what their institution stands for. And I feel like if we are, and I say this as an advocate of free speech, I don't think that a university as a place of learning and study and reflection can be can explain careless speech, uninformed speech as protected in some way because you can say what you want. Because if that is the case, there is no difference between, on campus and off campus, and off campus is cheaper, if you get my drift. What is it universities are supposed to do? They're supposed to encourage critical thinking, um, the expectation of preparation, that you are speaking from a body of fact and experience, and not just spouting because you have. And the reason for that is not to get everybody to be wishy-washy and milquetoast, I don't think. But it's to have some real credibility in what you say, and rather than just um, a performative quality to what you say. Does that make sense?
Mhm. No, that makes sense.
These are
And
the opinions for me to express because I'm not in the hot seat. I'm not a university president. I'm not
Mhm.
I'm not a Fortune 50 CEO. I have some sense of the range of interests that have to be considered. So I'm not pretending that this is simple, but I do think that there are right now in particular, there are real threats to a functioning democracy, um, a functioning society, and frankly, functioning capitalism, because they're all interconnected. That if that where neutrality could be confused with a lack of leadership at a time when we need it. Maybe I'll put it that
Mm.
way.
Gotcha. And absent this neutrality, though, so let's imagine a world in which um, private organizations, be they some universities or big corporate interests, is represented in CEOs or, you know, people on the board, what have you, make statements that are critical to their communities, does that not inevitably lead to these big entities entering the political fray? And is that something that you worry about?
I do. I worry about that. I worry about the fact that now almost everything is politicized. Um, I mean, if you'd asked me in 2019 whether it would be possible ever for a global pandemic to be politicized, I wouldn't have thought that was possible. And yet along came 2020, and that's what we did with COVID. Imagine um, a global health emergency turning into a political touch point. So I guess that from that perspective, having said that, it feels even more understandable why the reluctance of folks to in positions of authority to express themselves. And I am not saying, and I do not want to be heard to say, though you cannot resist, Professor, the taking me down a hypothetical trail, um, that institutions that um, have embraced neutrality um, must always must never be neutral. That's not what I'm saying. I think neutrality probably for many institutions and for most universities makes sense academically. I'm simply saying that when at a time uh, when the role of universities themselves as contributing to the health of a successful democracy is um, in the crosshairs, that is not a time for neutrality. There is some appropriate and timely um, response that should be that I think the larger public needs from university leaders or business leaders, as the case may be.
Mhm. Let me back out a little bit, and think about the relationship between public and private a little bit differently. So some people talk about government as a business, sort of private enterprise with citizens as customers, right? So
Mhm.
it's a metaphor where you think of like business as a metaphor for government. And you see some of that operating right now with things like the Department of Governmental Efficiency, where it's easy to see this idea of private industry efficiency being used to try to improve. And we can debate. I'm going to put that aside to try to improve government. The question I have is, where do you think this metaphor holds, and where do you think it breaks down? Because like all metaphors, it's imperfect. You might think it's a terrible metaphor, that's fine, but I'm curious how you think about that way of putting government and private industry kind of side by side, or understanding them through a similar lens.
So I think there are some things I learned in the private sector that were enormously useful to me when I was in the public sector, and vice versa, frankly. I think large institutions, just as one example, if you don't go win middle management, there's no number of edicts you can issue from the top that will actually survive or
Mm,
succeed, for that matter. Um, I think the idea of a government that is much more responsive to the public it serves, meaning um, time to decision making, regulating at the speed of business if the regulation affects business, being sensitive to that,
mm,
making it simpler. I mean, if you're a person who gets public benefit A, let's say you're a person who's a poor person, you need this benefit. You may also be eligible for that benefit and that one. Why can't you have one-stop shopping for that? Why do you have to go from office to office and with all the hassle that goes? I love that the idea of rethinking and making our government more efficient. Two things I would say. I would add to that. One is that leading government is just not the same thing as leading a business. It's just not. It's, in Massachusetts, we have nearly 7 million people. I had 7 million board members. That is different from a company that has 7 board members. And trying to understand what those board members are directing you to do and not do is a different kind of thing than where there are 7. But it's a better thing than having just 7 presumed to speak for everybody, right? Because you don't always hear the nuance or the voices of the meek alongside the mighty. The other is that the the public interest writ large is simply not the same as a private interest, and it ought not be. It has to be a balance of interest. Maybe that's a different way of making the same point I made just then. So,
Hmm. And do you worry about that metaphor and how it affects the way government operates?
well, I worry about the I mean, if you're asking me in particular about the so-called Doge. Um, you know, I don't know of a business that just goes around breaking things without any idea whatsoever about what it's going to build in its place. If it's simply saying, we're gonna gut healthcare because we can, or we think we can, or we can do it before the courts tell us we can't. Um, that doesn't really solve anything in terms of meeting the needs of people's healthcare. Uh, um, whether they are veterans or poor people or the elderly or what have you. I mean, just as one example, it is every once in a while in American history we have reinvented what it is we want our government to do and not do. We have reconsidered that. And most of the time, it has been, at least looking back, it has been um, thoughtful and balanced, and it had an outcome in mind. I don't know that Doge has any outcome in mind other than breaking things because they can,
Hmm.
and that is, or think they can, and that is that's not a good look.
Hmm. I find it I find it interesting that the one way to it's been presented is that this is what people voted for. So that tells you something about the state of their feelings about the pre-existing system, right? And so in that situation, is it servant leadership to try to make, vast changes?
I'm really glad you make that point because I agree that a lot of people who voted for uh, for the winning ticket voted their frustration with the way things were. I share some of that frustration, and by the way, I think a whole lot of folks who voted for the other ticket um, share some of those frustrations. I want to make 2 points. Number one, an agenda of revenge and anger is not a forward-looking or productive agenda. I told you, the idea of dismantling things um, alone is not serious. An idea of dismantling things because you want to replace it with something else, because you want to replace it with an actually more efficient government and not just a vision of everybody being on his or her own, is not serious. Um, that's number one. Number two, a lot of people, what was it, 77 million people voted for the Republican ticket, 74 or 5 million for the Democratic ticket. 90 million people eligible to vote stayed home and did nothing. And I think that underscores what I have felt for a long time, and maybe this is a way of supporting your point. I don't think the political dynamic in America is Democrat, Republican at all. I think it's insider, outsider. And we have right now insiders breaking things, it seems, because they think they can, and outsiders who will bear the consequence, meaning all the rest of us, whatever your party is or no party at all, who will bear the consequences without the least regard for that being given for the folks inside who are doing all the breaking.
Mhm. So, one last question for you. What would you like to leave people with as they think about the intersections between public and private leadership?
Well, first of all, I think we're all hungry for leadership, and not just folks who have the big job, but folks who have the big job and actually want to do the big job, whatever the big job is. But the leadership we need is again what I think of as servant leadership, leadership that's thinking about all of us, and not just him or herself and their next big job. And I think we have it within our power politically and more on the private side, to express our hunger for that and frankly our insistence for that. And the next time somebody says they want this big job or they want your vote for something, ask them why they want it and what it is, what vision they have for how to make the rest of our lives better, and make choices of that kind. I think the more that the rest of us express that, the more we will get the government and the private sector leadership that we deserve.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time and the thoughtful responses. It's been great.
I appreciate the hard questions. I'm going to get you for those.